The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Meredith Calloway learned she no longer owned anything. She was standing in the solicitor's office on Grosvenor Street, a narrow room that smelled of coal smoke and old paper, when Mr. Ashby slid the document across his desk as though it were an unpleasant thing he did not wish to touch. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the window, because she did not want Mr. Ashby to see her face. Her uncle, Lord Silas Calloway, had exercised the entailment. She had known it was possible. Her father had explained it to her once, years ago, in the kind of careful way that men explained things to daughters they half expected would never need to understand. The estate at Fenwick, the house, the grounds, the tenant farms, all of it, passed through the male line. Her father had died without a son. She had always known this. What she had not known, what she had perhaps refused to consider, was that her uncle would move so quickly. Her father had been dead 6 weeks. "There is a provision," Mr. Ashby said, "for a modest allowance, until such time as you are." "Married," she said. "Yes." She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. The provision was £80 per year. She had spent more than that on firewood alone last winter at Fenwick. Outside, the street was wet with recent rain, the cobblestones slick and dark. She walked for a long time without knowing where she was going, and when she finally stopped, it was because she had reached the park and there was nowhere left to walk without turning around. Her father had trusted Silas. That was the part she kept returning to, not the entailment. That was law, cold and impersonal. But her father had sat at Silas's table at Christmas and called him brother, and believed, apparently, that if the worst happened, Silas would look after things, that Silas would look after her. £80 per year. She had one friend in London, Beatrice Norwood, who had been at school with her and who now lived in a rented house in Bloomsbury with a canary and a great many books. Meredith went to Beatrice that afternoon and told her everything. Beatrice listened without interrupting, which was more than most people would have done. "You could contest it," Beatrice said. "Mr. Ashby says I cannot. Mr. Ashby is your uncle's solicitor." Meredith looked at her. That had not occurred to her. "You need your own solicitor," Beatrice said. "Someone who isn't already in Silas's pocket." She found one, a man named Mr. Fenn, who had a small practice near Gray's Inn, and who charged considerably less than Mr. Ashby. Mr. Fenn read the entailment documents, and then read them again, and then set them down with the expression of a man who had bad news he was trying to arrange into good news first. "The entailment is valid," he said. "I'm sorry. Is there nothing?" "There is one thing." He hesitated. "The terms of your father's will include a clause, not unusual in these arrangements, that specifies the estate must be actively managed by the holder of the entailment within 1 year of transfer, or certain rights revert. The question is whether your uncle intends to take up residence at Fenwick or simply let it." "He won't live there," Meredith said. Silas lived in Bath. He had always hated Fenwick. He found the north disagreeable. If he installs a steward and does not himself reside there, and if you were in a position to contest the management— Mr. Fenn stopped. "It would require you to be present at the estate, to have direct knowledge of how it was being run, testimony, documents, evidence of mismanagement." "I see. It is unlikely to succeed," he said honestly. "But it is not impossible." She went back to Beatrice's house that night and sat in the kitchen while Beatrice made tea, and the canary sang softly in the other room. "I have to go to Fenwick," Meredith said. "Your uncle will know immediately." "Not if I don't go as myself." Beatrice set down the teapot. "Meredith, he's already installed a new housekeeper. Mrs. Daventry, someone from Bath, no one who knows me. The understaff is mostly new as well. I wrote to Agnes Pratt before I came to London and she told me. Agnes has been there 30 years and she doesn't trust any of them. Agnes Pratt is 70 and possibly mad. Agnes Pratt was my father's housekeeper for 3 decades, and she is the sharpest woman in Cumberland. Meredith wrapped both hands around her mug. She says there's a position open, downstairs. A lady's maid, for the wife of the man Silas has leased the East Wing to. Beatrice was very quiet for a moment. He's leased the East Wing. Apparently the roof of the main house wants work, and Silas does not want to pay for it. He's leased it too. She looked at the paper Agnes had sent. A Viscount Aldenmere? I don't know him. He took a long lease because he wanted the shooting. He's brought his mother. And you want to be his mother's lady's maid. I want to be inside that house. Beatrice opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she poured her tea and said, "You are going to need a different name." She became Miss Lena Marsh. It was close enough to her real name that she would answer to it without thinking, and common enough that no one would remark on it. She gave herself a history from Lancashire. A merchant's, Hess' daughter, some schooling, previous employment in a house in Manchester that had since closed. Beatrice wrote her a character reference on note paper she purchased specially for the purpose, signing it with the name of a woman they invented together over 2 hours and a bottle of wine. She arrived at Fenwick on a gray October morning, when the hills were beginning to rust with autumn and the air tasted of coming cold. The carriage from Carlisle set her down at the gates, and she walked the long drive carrying her own bag, because she was Miss Marsh now, and Miss Marsh was not the sort of person who was met at the gate. The house looked the same. That was what she had not been prepared for. She had half expected it to be already dismantled, transformed, made unrecognizable. But there it was, the gray stone front, the familiar line of windows, the oak at the corner that her father had planted the year she was born. She stopped walking for a moment and looked at it, and something in her chest did something painful and complicated that she did not allow herself to examine. Then she picked up her bag and went round to the servants' entrance. Mrs. Daventry was a thin woman with a precise manner and eyes that catalogued everything. She looked Meredith over and asked her 3 questions, and then handed her to the under-housekeeper and said she would do. Agnes Pratt found her that first evening in the linen room. The old woman stood in the doorway and looked at her without speaking for a long time. Then she said, "You look like your father, please," Meredith said quietly. Agnes came in and closed the door behind her. She did not embrace her. Agnes Pratt was not a woman who embraced, but she put one dry hand briefly over Meredith's and said, "He would not like this." "The Viscount is not like your uncle," Agnes said. "I want you to know that before you form an opinion." Meredith thought that was a strange thing to say. She filed it away. Viscount Aldenmere was not what she had expected. She had formed, without meaning to, a picture of the sort of man who would lease another man's estate for the shooting season. Something careless and loud, with more money than consideration. What she found was a man who was quiet in a way that seemed deliberate, who moved through the house as though he had calculated exactly how much space he was permitted to occupy, and had decided to occupy slightly less. His name was Charles Aldenmere. He was perhaps 35, with a quality about him that she could not immediately name. Not coldness exactly, but a kind of reserve so complete it had the same effect. He said good morning to the servants when he passed them in the corridor, which Meredith suspected was more than Silas would have done, and he did not raise his voice. She could hear him sometimes from the East Gallery, where he worked in the evenings, the scratch of his pen going steadily on and on. His mother was Lady Aldenmere, Margaret, though no one called her that, a small woman in her late 60s who had apparently decided several years ago that she was entitled to say exactly what she thought about everything. She had opinions about window hangings, about the quality of the cream, about the temperature of rooms. She was not unkind. She was simply a woman who had spent 60-odd years exercising her preferences and saw no reason to stop. Meredith had imagined the position would be intolerable. It was not. Lady Aldenmere treated her with the casual assumption of a woman who had always been waited upon and saw nothing remarkable in it, which was somehow easier than pointed attention would have been. And there was something in Lady Aldenmere's directness that Meredith, after months of solicitors and evasion and careful language, found unexpectedly restoring. "You do my hair better than the last girl," Lady Aldenmere told her one morning, watching her in the mirror with the frank assessment she gave everything. The last girl was from Shropshire. She had a very firm hand. "I'm sorry if No, I prefer yours. I'm simply making an observation." Lady Aldenmere turned her head slightly to examine the result. "Lancashire," Meredith said. "Lancashire." A pause. "You don't have the accent." "I was schooled away." Lady Aldenmere did not seem entirely convinced, but let it go. "My son was at Fenwick last year, before the lease." "Did you know the previous family, the Calloways?" Meredith kept her hand steady. "No, my lady, the father died recently." "Shame. Charles said he was a decent sort." She picked up her rings from the dressing table and began putting them on, one by one. "The uncle is managing things now, apparently. He came last month, didn't stay, just sent instructions through a steward, the man Aldcroft." She paused. "I should not have told you that. It isn't your concern." "Of course," Meredith said. But she had heard it. Aldcroft. The steward Silas had installed. She had heard the name before. She thought of Mr. Fenn's careful words, evidence of mismanagement. She began to pay attention in a different way after that. The difficulty was that Aldcroft did not make it easy to find things out. He came and went irregularly, and kept most of his communications in a locked case, and Mrs. Daventry, who reported to him, was the kind of woman who answered questions about the household with other questions. Meredith moved carefully. She was not in a hurry to be reckless. What she learned came slowly and from the edges. Agnes Pratt knew more than anyone. The tenant farmers on the Fenwick land, men whose families had been there for generations, were being told their rents would increase in the spring. Not modestly, substantially, more than the land warranted, more than was reasonable, more than her father would ever have asked. She heard this from Agnes, who had heard it from the daughter of one of the tenants, who had come to the house to ask a question no one could answer. She also learned that Aldcroft was diverting maintenance funds. She did not have proof of this yet. Not the kind Mr. Fenn would need. But the roof over the north bedroom was beginning to leak, and the drainage on the south field had not been cleared as it should have been before winter. And when she asked Agnes carefully how much had been set aside for repairs, Agnes's expression told her everything. She began keeping notes on paper she hid inside the lining of her second-best coat. It was Viscount Aldenmere who complicated things. She had not expected to speak to him, not directly, not more than the brief exchanges the position required. He was a tenant in a leased wing. She was his mother's maid. Their paths did not cross in any meaningful way. But there was a night in November, a few weeks after her arrival, when she was coming back from the village. She had gone on an errand for Lady Aldenmere, a particular kind of thread that could only be found at a specific shop in the High Street. And the rain came down so suddenly and so completely that she was soaked through before she could reach the house. She came in through the east door and found him standing in the corridor. He had apparently been reading, was still holding the book. He looked at her with no expression she could read, and she was acutely aware that she looked like something the river had brought in. "Miss Marsh," he said, "my lord." She was already moving past him. "There's a fire in the study," he said. "It would be sensible." She stopped. Sensible. She was going to say no. She should say no. But she was so cold. Her hands had gone stiff, and he had already turned back toward the study door and was holding it open with the unself-conscious assurance of a man who did not expect to be refused. She went in. He did not attempt conversation. He set her chair close enough to the fire to be useful and went back to the other chair and his book as though she were not there, or rather as though her being there required nothing from him. She sat and dripped quietly onto his rug and began slowly to be warm again. After perhaps 20 minutes she said, "Thank you." He looked up. "Of course." A pause. He had been reading a volume on agricultural drainage. She could see the spine, which struck her as an odd choice for an evening of leisure. She filed that away too. "Do you find the house comfortable?" she asked, which was not the question she had intended to ask. It had come out before she could stop it. He seemed to consider this genuinely. "It's a well-built house," he said. "Older than it looks. The east wing is better maintained than the main house. The main house has been let go somewhat, I think." "Has it?" she said carefully. "The south field drainage needs clearing," he said. "I noticed in August when I first came. It still hasn't been done." He said it without emphasis, simply as a fact. He looked back at his book. She left when she was dry enough not to leave a trail on the floor. But she thought about that conversation for several days afterward. He had noticed. He had noticed the south field drainage, and he had said it like a man who found it troubling. She found the ledger in December. Agnes had told her that Aldcroft kept papers in the estate office, the small room behind the main staircase that had been her father's office and still smelled, faintly, of the pipe tobacco he had favored. She had no key and no pretense for being there. She waited until a morning when Aldcroft was in Carlisle and Mrs. Daventry had gone with him. Some joint errand she had not quite caught, and then she did something that would have horrified her father, and that she chose not to think about too carefully. Oh, the lock was simple. Her father, rainy afternoon, when she was Pete's, how to spring it with a hairpin. How to spring it with a hair. He had thought she would forget. She had not. Inside, the papers were in more order than she had expected. Aldcroft was, whatever else he was, a methodical man. The rent ledger was in the right-hand drawer, and she had just enough time to copy out the relevant figures. The altered entries. The discrepancies between what was recorded as received and what she knew from Agnes had actually been paid. Onto 2 sheets of paper that went into her coat lining with the rest. She was closing the drawer when she heard the door. She turned. Lord Aldenmere stood in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment, then at the desk, then back at her. His face did not change. "Miss Marsh," he said. She said nothing. There was nothing useful she could say. "That is not your coat," he said. She looked down. She had taken her coat off when she sat at the desk and put it on the chair beside her, and the lining was open at the seam where she had tucked papers in. He could see it. She stood very still. He came into the room and closed the door behind him. "I went to Carlisle this morning," he said. "But I turned back. I forgot something." He stopped by the window and looked out at the grounds for a moment. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I arrived," she said. He turned back to her. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not alarmed, something she could not name. "Who are you?" She thought about the false name, the Lancashire merchant, the invented character. She thought about how long she had held those in place, and how thin they felt now, stretched over what was actually true. She thought about Agnes saying, "He is not like your uncle." "My name is Meredith Calloway," she said. "This is my father's house." The silence stretched long enough that she could hear the fire in the other room popping. "I see," he said finally. "I am aware that I have been." She stopped. "I am aware of how this looks. I will leave if you ask me to. I understand you are within your rights, but I needed." She pressed her mouth together. "I needed to know what was being done to this place, what Aldcroft is doing, what my uncle has allowed him to do." He said nothing. "The rents," she said. "The maintenance funds. the south field drainage. She looked at him steadily. "You noticed, you said so, you thought it was wrong." Another long silence. He pulled out the chair she had been sitting in, and sat down. He looked at the desk, and then at the coat on the chair beside him with its open lining, and then at her. "Sit down, Miss Calloway," he said. She sat. "Tell me what you've found," he said. She told him everything, not only what was in the ledger, the numbers and discrepancies she had copied, but the tenant farmers, and the rents and the things Agnes had told her about the maintenance funds. She told him about Mr. Fenn and the clause in the will and the year's window. She told him about Beatrice and the invented character and the name she had borrowed from her own life. She told him all of it, sitting across from him in her father's office, and he listened without interrupting in a way that reminded her, painfully, of Beatrice. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The clause," he said. "You have a year until April." He looked at the papers she had spread on the desk, the copies she had made, the original ledger still visible in the drawer. He reached past her and drew the ledger out and opened it to the page she had indicated. He looked at the figures for a long time. "This is not mismanagement," he said finally. "What he has done here, this is deliberate. These entries have been altered. See this figure here? The ink is a different shade. He has changed the received amounts after recording them." She leaned forward. She had not seen that. "He has been pocketing the difference," Lord Aldenmere said. "This is not negligence, Miss Calloway. This is fraud." The words sat in the room like something solid. "Will it be enough?" she asked. "For Mr. Fenn. For Mr. Fenn." He paused. "For a court, if it comes to that." He set the ledger down. "Your uncle may not have known. He may have trusted Aldcroft as your father trusted your uncle. Or he may have known and not cared." He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at him across the desk. At the straight line of his expression, the careful quality of his attention, she thought about the agricultural drainage book and the south field, and the way he had said the main house has been let go somewhat, as though it bothered him personally, as though it were a thing that should not be allowed. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. He looked at her. "This is a good house," he said. "It should be looked after." That was all he said. But something in the plainness of it, the way it did not reach for more than it was, settled something in her that she had not known was unsettled. They worked together after that. It was not what she would have anticipated. He was a man of specifics. He wanted precise dates and figures, not impressions, and he was rigorous in a way that made her glad she had been careful in her own notes. He also had resources she did not. He knew a solicitor in London who was not connected to her uncle. He knew a man who had worked in Chancery and understood exactly how such a case would need to be built. He wrote letters. He made inquiries. He did these things efficiently and without drama, as though the problem before them was simply a problem to be solved. She was aware, occasionally, that the situation was unusual. She was still nominally his mother's lady's maid. She still did Lady Aldenmere's hair each morning and found her particular thread and answered when she rang. But evenings, sometimes, when Lady Aldenmere had retired and the house was quiet, she would come to the study with her notes and he would be there and they would work. Lady Aldenmere was not, Meredith suspected, as oblivious as she appeared. "You seem better lately," she told Meredith one morning. "You came here looking rather thin." "I am well, my lady. My son is well also," Lady Aldenmere said in the tone of someone introducing a non sequitur that was not actually non sequitur at all. "He has not been well, not for some time, not since." She stopped. "Well, he seems better," Meredith said nothing. But she thought about it later, standing at the window of the servants' sitting room, watching the frost on the grounds. She had not, she realized, thought much about herself in all of this, about what she would do if the case succeeded, where she would go, what came after. She had been so focused on the fight that the life beyond it had remained a gray abstraction. She supposed she would return to London. She supposed she would live on the £80 per year or find a position that was genuinely a position and not a cover story. She supposed she would eventually stop waking in the night with the specific weight of this house pressing on her chest. She supposed. Aldcroft came back in January and stayed. This changed things. She could no longer go to the office. She could barely move freely through the parts of the house that adjoined his work. She felt the constraint of it, the careful smallness required of her, with a sharpness that she had not felt at the beginning, when she had still been too tightly wound to notice much of anything. She was carrying a tray to Lady Aldenmere one afternoon, when Aldcroft stepped into the corridor from the office doorway. He looked at her. He had looked at her before. She had felt it, the way one feels a gaze that is trying to place something. Today his expression had changed. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Mr. Aldcroft." She kept walking. A moment. She stopped, turned, kept her face neutral. "I understand you have been spending time in the east wing of an evening," he said, "with Lord Aldenmere. Lady Aldenmere sometimes requires. Lady Aldenmere retires at 9, he said. It has been past 10 on several occasions." She said nothing. "I wonder," he said, "if Lord Aldenmere knows who you really are." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere distant, a door closed. "I am Miss Lena Marsh," she said, "from Lancashire." His expression did not change. "I wonder," he said again. "You are very like the late Lord Calloway, about the eyes." She made herself hold still. She made herself breathe at exactly the rate she had been breathing before. "Good afternoon, Mr. Aldcroft," she said. She carried the tray to Lady Aldenmere's room and set it down and excused herself and went directly to the east wing. Lord Aldenmere was not in the study. She waited. He came in 20 minutes later and stopped when he saw her face. "He knows," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Or suspects. It amounts to the same thing." She sat down because she did not fully trust her legs. "If he tells my uncle, then your uncle removes you from the property and the access you have is gone." He came in and closed the door. "How certain are you that the papers we have are enough?" She thought about it honestly. "I think they are nearly enough. The altered ledger entries, the testimony I can provide from Agnes about the tenant rents." Mr. Fenn said, "Fenn is cautious by temperament," he said. "He will always say nearly enough." He moved to the desk and stood thinking for a moment, his hands braced against the surface. "I have a contact at the county court, a clerk who owes me a considerable favor. If I write tonight, it is January," she said. "April is the deadline. Then we should not waste January." He said it with the same calm he brought to everything, and she sat there looking at him. This man who had had no particular reason to involve himself, who had walked into his leased estate for the shooting season and found instead all of this, and felt something she had been trying for quite some time not to feel. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It was the second time she had asked him something like that. He looked at her steadily. "I told you," he said, "this is a good house. That is not an answer." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression, the same thing she had seen sometimes in the evenings, when they were working, and he would look up from the papers and catch her already looking at him. Something contained, something he had decided, it seemed, not to say. "It will be your house again," he said. "That matters." She looked at the fire. Her throat felt uncertain. "And after that?" she said. A long silence. "Miss Calloway," he said, and his voice was different, quieter, without the careful neutral quality it usually carried. "I think you know what I would say if the circumstances were different. If you were not here under a false name in a house you are trying to take back from your uncle through a legal clause, and if I had not." He stopped. "I think you know." She did know. She had known for several weeks. She had been not knowing it deliberately, which is a kind of knowing. "When it is resolved," she said. He looked at her. "Ask me then," she said, "when it's done." The papers were filed in February by Mr. Fenn in consultation with Lord Aldenmuir's London solicitor, who turned out to be a considerably more aggressive legal advocate than Fenn had been inclined to be on his own. The altered ledger, which Meredith had spent one sleepless night photographing in detail by lamplight before returning it to the drawer, was presented as evidence of systematic fraud, the testimony of 4 tenant farmers, obtained through a quiet process that Lord Aldenmuir managed and that she was not entirely clear on, substantiated the rent increases. Agnes Pratt, aged 71 and still the sharpest woman in Cumberland, gave her own accounting of the maintenance funds, with the air of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Aldcroft was gone by March. He did not go quietly, but he went. Her uncle Silas arrived in person, which she had not expected. He came on a Tuesday. She had not forgotten the first Tuesday, and she met him in the entrance hall of her father's house, and she was not Miss Lena Marsh when she did it. She was wearing her own clothes, the ones she had brought in the bottom of her bag. She stood on the stone floor her father had stood on, under the ceiling her father had looked up at, and she watched her uncle's face change as he understood who she was. He did not speak for a long moment. "This is not finished," he said. "No," she said, "but it will be." He left without going further into the house. She watched his carriage go down the long drive, past the oak her father had planted, and she stood there until it was out of sight. Lord Aldenmuir was standing a few feet behind her. He had not been asked to stay, but he had stayed. When the carriage disappeared, she turned around. He was watching her in the way he sometimes did. Carefully, quietly, as though she were something that required his full attention. "It will take time," he said. "Even with the papers. I know, months, perhaps. I know," she said again. And then, because she had said "ask me then" and then was arriving, even if it was arriving slowly through the machinery of courts and clerks and cautious solicitors. "You said you would ask me," he looked at her. "You said when it was done," he said. "It is not yet done." "No," she said. "But I find that I am not inclined to wait for done." Something shifted in his face, not dramatically. Not the way things shifted in the novels Lady Aldenmuir kept on her nightstand. Quietly, like a door that has been held closed for a long time, opened at last by someone who finally had the right key. "Then I am asking," he said. Outside, the March wind came down off the hills and moved through the oak's bare branches, and the house stood solid and gray and familiar behind them, and Meredith Calloway said yes.